Ready? This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good afternoon and welcome to the Environment Subcommittee's first hearing of 2020. This is my first hearing since taking over the subcommittee chairmanship from my colleague and friend, Ms. Fletcher. I'm looking forward to continuing the bipartisan work of this subcommittee with Ranking Member Marshall on issues related to the environment, climate change, and weather research, issues that are critical to New Jersey and to the country. This is also a joint subcommittee hearing with the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee, and I'd like to welcome my fellow chair, Dr. Foster, and Ranking Member, Mr. Norman. I assume they will be here shortly. The focus of today's hearing is painfully salient in New Jersey, a historically flood-prone state. New Jersey is a place where both coastal and inland communities have unfortunately had to deal with extensive flooding events, and as a result, actively invest in understanding and mitigating these flood risks. In my district, towns such as Pequannock, Little Falls, Woodland Park, Pompton Lakes, and Wayne that experience some of the most extreme flooding work hard to protect their residents with measures like home buyouts, elevations, dredging waterways, and even flying drones to proactively identify flood hazards in rivers. They appreciate that the National Flood Insurance Program is a critical part of providing this protection to communities and are committed to partner with you to get the science underlying the FEMA flood mapping process right. Assessments of flood risks today must consider that climate change is accelerating rates of sea level rise, intense heavy rains, and other extreme weather events, creating flooding patterns distinct and more damaging than norms of the past. And it's not just New Jersey and coastal communities, as Ranking Member Marshall knows too well. Inland states face billions of dollars of damage from extreme wet conditions consistent with climate change last year, with a similar forecast just released by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for the coming year for the Mississippi River and Great Plains Basin. The FEMA flood maps are intended to determine insurance rates for 1 year ahead and set building standards for the floodplain. Despite this intention, the reality is that homeowners and local governments continue to use the maps to make both short and long-term decisions like buying a home, choosing a mortgage, and planning adaptation measures to deal with the future flooding events. Given the public need, we must ensure that the most up-to-date science of predicting flood risk is accessible in a centralized, accurate, and easy-to-understand way. While we are primarily focused today on supporting interagency efforts in federal flood mapping, I also want to emphasize the importance of incorporating on-the-ground community feedback into the FEMA flood mapping process. My understanding from local officials and constituents in my district is that providing such input can be onerous, expensive, and frustrating. We have, for example, a case in Pequannock where scientific models adopted by an approved FEMA cooperating technical partner in New Jersey have not been admitted into a remapping appeals process. In instances of delays in resolutions that put homeowners in our communities in a flood map limbo, affecting their ability to sell homes, make improvements to their property, and move forward on important municipal planning decisions. I believe this local expertise is critical to getting the science of our flood maps right and want to understand how we can best support FEMA's efforts to partner with communities not only in New Jersey, but across the country to incorporate local scientific expertise efficiently and in a common sense way. In this hearing, I hope we can have a constructive conversation about how agencies can leverage their unique capabilities and local information to improve the science and communication around flood risk. While FEMA is the expert in administering disaster aid and mitigating risk on the floodplain, science agencies like NOAA are hard at work collecting data on flood-prone environments, developing state-of-the-art models, and generating forecasts, maps, and other communications. I hope that we can find interagency synergies that improve the science and get it out there into communities where it is sorely needed. And science is only one part of the solution, as the other communities of jurisdiction working hard on flood mitigation know well. In fact, this morning I submitted a statement for the record to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for their Member Day hearing, outlining my district's priorities related to the development of the Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, which included the need to address flood risk. I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panel of today's hearing. They will provide the perspective of both the federal government and on-the-ground experts. The chair now recognizes Dr. Marshall for an opening statement.
All right, thank you so much for holding this joint subcommittee hearing. Chairwoman Sherrill and Chairman Foster, as you said earlier, this is the first time the Environment Subcommittee has convened since you were appointed Chairwoman, so let me welcome you as well to the subcommittee and look forward to working with you as well. I want to express my appreciation for this committee's focus on improving our preparedness in a changing climate. We have held hearings of all kinds of extreme weather, from windstorms to hurricanes to weather prediction models. Policy that helps protect lives and property is a responsibility that should be at the top of every member of Congress' priority list. Today's hearing is another chance to discuss a type of extreme weather event and how we are preparing to lessen the damage and effects it causes. Flood events occur in every state and territory and cause an average of 80 deaths per year. It's easy to see how coastal areas like Florida or New Jersey are susceptible, but these events also have a great impact on agriculture, food, supply, and crop insurance for inland states like Kansas. In 2019, Kansas saw one of the worst years of extensive flooding, with at least $15 million of infrastructure damage and $3.8 million in federal flood insurance claims. It's impossible to gauge just how much damage this has caused on topsoil loss, land realignment, and other factors that affect the day-to-day life of the agriculture community. What we do know is that 13 dams were damaged and well systems were overwhelmed so much that trucks are still delivering up to 40,000 gallons of clean water every day to northeast Kansas. But as the saying goes, from challenges come opportunity. The Kansas Department of Agriculture, already underway with the project to map the state's floodplains with 2D technology, has used the 2019 floods as a way of validating their models and gaining trust among communities. They have also spread more awareness of the state's base flood elevation portal, a collaborative project that allows users to draw a polygon for their property and see BFE value as well as the approximate lowest adjacent grade value based on LIDAR. This type of tool is extremely helpful because it gives property owners an idea of their chances to obtain a letter of map revision before they spend money on a surveyor. I look forward to hearing Mr. Ryan Branfort's testimony on how similar technologies and services, along with geospatial data, can help improve the flood mapping of FEMA and other federal agencies. I also look forward to hearing from all our witnesses on the progress of the USGS 3D Elevation Program, or 3DEP, as it moves forward with the goal of completing a nationwide LIDAR mapping by 2023. 67% of the nation has been completed, and more than 600 different applications will benefit from this enhanced elevation data, including flood risk management and precision agriculture. And now I'd like to enter this document of the record showing organizations that support 3DEP.
Without objection.
The idea that a federal program can satisfy multiple needs and be used in so many different ways is what every program should strive to achieve. If we are going to spend millions of taxpayer dollars in a multi-year coordinated effort, I hope the final result is not a simple one-trick pony. I want to again thank our witnesses for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chair of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Dr. Foster, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sherrill. The nuts and bolts of the National Flood Insurance Program are something that we've spent countless hours on in the Financial Services Committee, the other hat I wear around here. There are a lot of factors that go into the insurance side of the program that we won't get into today, but I'm very glad that the Science Committee is taking a look at the whole federal enterprise of flood prediction and decision support tools. This is one of those policy topics where the scientific inputs and outputs have a direct impact on the daily lives of millions of Americans. If we don't prioritize accuracy, precision, and granularity in the mapping and forecasting of flood hazards and make the investments necessary to get the data to make those predictions accurate, then insurance requirements that we apply on American businesses and homeowners will never be fair. And the changing climate adds an uncontrolled variable into the quest for quality maps. The National Flood Insurance Act became law in 1968. Back then, anthropogenic climate change was not really a part of the public discourse, and federal policymakers saw the global climate as static. It made sense to create a program that would evaluate risk and designate premiums on a simple one-year annual outlook, because it was believed the climate in 2020 would look more or less like that of 1968. But now we know better. Global concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air have risen from 320 to 400 to over 400 parts per million. And setting aside the influence methane and the other greenhouse gases, which are roughly 30% of the other heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, yields a situation where global temperatures have already gone up about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1968. And the incidence and severity of flooding has increased as a result, and by no means are flood risk limited to coastal zones. Extreme rainfall are driving record river overflows and urban flooding throughout the Midwest. Last May, Illinois Governor Pritzker had to activate the Illinois National Guard to address the historic flood conditions. Illinois farmers saw so much hardship that, as a result, the USDA issued an agricultural disaster declaration. And it's not just homes, business, and farms that are being affected. Last week, I visited Strategic Air Command and Offutt Air Force Base, which flooded badly last spring, and the cleanup there is estimated to cost almost $1 billion. We can't ignore the fact that the climate change is here today. It's affecting our homes and our livelihoods, and the federal government needs to deploy new tools to address it. So I look forward to the hearing today about the opportunities to use the most advanced technologies and models to evaluate present-day flood risk, so we get an answer that's more accurate and more detailed than the status quo. You know, there are advancements in LIDAR, lower-cost flood sensors, drones, artificial intelligence algorithms can all help FEMA make the FEMA map more accurate and perhaps lower the cost of producing it. Perhaps there are also ways to leverage new applications for flood evaluation and prediction using the existing network of Earth monitoring satellites and supercomputers, such as Aurora, which is being built in my district at Argonne National Lab. The hydrology and climate data products put out by Mr. Osler's team at NOAA are first-rate, but maybe there are more effective ways to leverage those and improve those resources. Yes, there'll be tough questions anytime FEMA makes changes to their methods that affect the rates that people pay under the National Flood Insurance Program, and we're not going to resolve all those issues today, but I think we can all agree that a sophisticated scientific foundation is the best place to start. And I also want to think about the art of the possible for providing forward-looking decision support tools that will help property buyers understand their flood risk over the life of a 30-year mortgage. FEMA's flood maps are an insurance product that aren't really designed to show future conditions. We need to acknowledge that people may be counting on FEMA's maps for things that they weren't meant for. We need to acknowledge that home buyers want to make informed decisions about future flood risk when they take on a mortgage, and also that most home buyers can't afford to pay for a fancy private mapping firm in order to do that. Thank you to all of our witnesses for making time today, and I look forward to a productive conversation. And yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Mr. Norman, for an opening statement.
I want to thank all the witnesses. Thank you, Chairwoman Sherrill and Chairman Foster for having this meeting. This is near and dear to my heart. I'm a real estate developer who has developed property dealing with flood maps residentially, commercially. Also dealt with it on the wetland credits, which with regulations that are out of the roof, that 7 years generally to deal with the core, which hopefully we can make some suggestions and improvements. But we're here today to discuss how flooding impacts property owners and the ways that flood hazards and risk are communicated to the public, which is a big part of it. We will examine the science and data that FEMA and the NOAA leverage to generate and distribute federal flood products, the steps being taken to incorporate future flood hazards into these products, and the tools and technologies that exist to help property owners, coastal managers, and community stakeholders better understand and elevate and evaluate their flood risk. Flooding is both the most common and most costly natural disasters in the United States. Floods have caused more than $155 billion in property damage over the last 10 years and nearly 4,000 deaths since 1950. Roughly 75% of all presidential disaster declarations are related in some manner to flooding. In my home state of South Carolina, flooding is an even greater concern. A significant percentage of all South Carolina lands fall within floodplains designated as special flood hazard areas by FEMA. And although it ranks 23rd in total population, South Carolina is ranked 7th among all states in coastal flooding vulnerability, with roughly 400,000 people at risk of inland and coastal flooding throughout our state. Addressing our nation's flood risk requires buy-in from federal, state, local, and community stakeholders, not red tape and useless bureaucracy. Recognizing this, in 2018, Governor McMaster established the South Carolina Floodwater Commission to develop recommendations to alleviate and mitigate flood impacts to the state. Under the leadership of its chairman, retired Major General Tom Mulliken, this commission, unique for our state, took a realistic and a hands-on approach to mitigate flooding in our state. The recommendations offered by this extraordinary committee are the cornerstone of my home state's fight against extreme weather events. In recognition of their achievement, I offer to submit their report for the congressional record as an example to be admired and followed nationally. Yet, in spite of these valiant efforts, I recognize that South Carolina alone cannot solve our nation's flooding challenges. That's why I'm pleased to see that FEMA, NOAA, and the USGs are making positive strides in confronting this issue. They are working collaboratively to improve our understanding of flood hazards and risk and how best to communicate these risks to state and local communities, and also the general public, which needs to be informed. I encourage them to continue to improve and expand their interagency coordination to ensure that federal flood products are accurate, reliable, and comprehensible to the communities like those in South Carolina who rely on them for planning, zoning, and land use management. Preparedness is critical to combating the challenges that flooding presents, but proper preparation means taking steps now to improve our resilience to flood hazards and mitigate present and future flood risk. I look forward to learning more today about what FEMA and the NOAA are doing to improve federal flood mapping and how they are leveraging modern technology to gain a more accurate and granular understanding of flood risk and hazards in South Carolina and throughout our nation. Flooding events presents a great challenge, but through collaboration and coordination between all levels of government, community stakeholders, and private sector experts, it's a challenge that we can overcome and we can be successful. I again want to thank the witnesses for taking the time to be here today. Thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl, and I yield back.
Thank you. We are honored to have the full committee chairwoman, Ms. Johnson, here with us today. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. The FEMA flood mapping process is not a topic this committee has explored very deeply in the past. Our friends in the Financial Services Committee work hard to look after the authorizations and policy changes that the program needs, and they stay very busy doing it. But as with so many federal programs, there's an opportunity here for the Science, Space, and Technology Committee to make sure innovative technologies and cutting-edge strategies for analysts are being put to work for the good of the taxpayer. When we leverage the best available science, we can help make government programs perform better, deliver services quicker, and save money. In case of dealing with flooding, this country may need all the help it can get. By all objective measures, the severity and frequency of flooding is on a significant upward trend. The National Flood Insurance Program reached its maximum authority to borrow money in order to cover ratepayers' claims in September of 2017. And for the first time, the Treasury canceled a $16 billion debt. This happened in just in time for the hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, which delivered unprecedented damages in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico, as well as several neighboring states. FEMA had to borrow another $6.1 billion in order to address the heavy losses from these disasters. I will note that these communities are still healing from the 2017 hurricane season today. Even the best insurance can't fix the physical and emotional devastation caused by a flood that takes your home or your business. It is time to think creatively about how to help get better technologies for flood mapping, evaluation, and prediction into the marketplace. FEMA is working on a process called risk rating 2.0 that will incorporate new data points, modeling strategies, and enhanced granularity in order to provide a more accurate picture of flood risk. It would be beneficial if the process would also allow FEMA and its contracting partners to update its maps in a more timely fashion. FEMA will need to talk to Congress if it needs support or resources to make risk rating 2.0 a success. It's always worth asking the question of what research and development capabilities are available to an agency when it embarks upon an ambitious project like Risk Rating 2.0. I hope that the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security is playing a role in this process. The resources we have at other agencies like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, also need to be deployed to their greatest potential. NOAA's capabilities for Earth observation and predictive modeling along coastlines are unparalleled. NASA Earth Sciences and the U.S. Geological Survey have observational capabilities that we want to make sure are in that mix as well. As climate change continues to move the goalposts for flood risk, we need to make sure that all federal science agencies are coordinating closely in order to deliver information to taxpayers that can help them make sound decisions and keep themselves and their families safe. Texas has had a bad year of flooding in 2017. I know Oklahoma had a tough year with flooding in 2019. Ranking Member Lucas and I both understand that no region in the country is immune to flood risk, and that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I look forward to working with the members of both sides of the aisle and with the administration on strategies to leverage all of our scientific capabilities to address the challenges associated with increased flooding. I want to say as an aside, early last year, I had a meeting of our entire COG area, the Council of Governments area in North Texas, which is generally thought of as an inland area, which included FEMA and all the other agencies at every level of government. And we all decided we would work together to prevent, because prevention is so much better than having to pay for it afterwards. So I hope we will continue that, and thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, if there are any members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. First, I'll turn it over to Dr. Marshall, who will introduce his witness, Mr. Branfort.
All right, thank you again, Chairwoman Sherrill. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome a constituent of mine as a witness today. Mr. Ryan Branfort is a Senior Vice President at Wilson & Company Incorporated Engineer and Architects, where he manages the Surveying, Mapping, and GIS division. More importantly, though, he is a Kansas State University graduate. With a staff of nearly 100 individuals, his division performs work for a variety of federal, state, municipal, and private entities. He's held nearly every type of position in the Surveying and Mapping division, including field surveyor, party chief, CAD technician, GIS specialist, photogrammetrist, it's a new one, and various supervisory positions, giving him a well-rounded background in the field. He spent the last 15 years as part of the company's executive leadership team and served 6 years on Wilson & Company's board of directors. Wilson & Company itself has nearly 500 employees and 15 offices across 9 states, but I'd also like to point out that Mr. Branfort is based in the Saline office, which is less than a 5-minute drive from my district office. So it's nice to have a constituent and a workplace neighbor here in D.C. Thank you, Mr. Branfort, for making the trip up here and taking the time to testify. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Branfort. Next, we have Mr. Michael Grimm, who serves as the Assistant Administrator for Risk Management at the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration within FEMA. Under Mr. Grimm's direction, the Risk Management Directorate produces data, modeling, and programs that inform the public of natural disaster risk. The Risk Management Directorate manages the Risk Mapping, Analysis, and Planning, or RISC MAP, program within the National Flood Insurance Program, as well as other programs that prioritize federal investments in resilience projects and help to implement standards. Mr. Grimm has previously directed both FEMA's disaster mitigation programs and its individual assistance division. Prior to joining FEMA, Mr. Grimm worked in several other governmental positions, including with the City of Fort Collins, Colorado, the State of Wyoming, and the United States Geological Survey National Research Program. He holds a Master of Science in Earth Resources from Colorado State University. So a little far afield from my home state of New Jersey, but welcome. Next, we have Mr. Mark Osler, who serves as Senior Advisor for Coastal Inundation and Resilience at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Mr. Osler works to coordinate and advance coastal flood science at NOAA and improve decision-makers' ability to prepare for and respond to ongoing changes affecting coastal communities. He also advises NOAA leadership on coastal research, applied science, and policy strategy. He's focused on improving interagency coordination and strengthening partnerships with non-federal organizations. Prior to joining NOAA, Mr. Osler worked in the private sector for 17 years. He received a master's degree in coastal engineering from the University of Delaware, and we're happy to have you here today. Our final witness is Mr. Chad Berginnis. Mr. Berginnis has served the executive director for the Association of State Floodplain Managers since 2012. Prior to this, he served in several other roles at ASFPM and in floodplain management at the state and local level in Ohio. He has also worked in private sector hazard mitigation. In all, he has been working in floodplain management for nearly 30 years. As executive director for ASFPM, Mr. Berginnis works with federal agencies and Congress to advocate for policies dealing with flood risk, water management, and natural disaster resilience. He also develops tools for local decision makers and works with professional associations, ASFPM chapters, and private sector partners. Mr. Berginnis holds a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Ohio State University and is a certified floodplain manager. Thank you all for being here today. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your oral testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I ask your help. As you see, you're getting closer to your 5 minutes, starting to wrap up your answer, so everyone has opportunities. And so we will start today with Mr. Grimm.
Good afternoon, Chairman Foster and Chairwoman Sherrill, Chairwoman Johnson, ranking members Norman and Marshall, and members of the committee. My name is Michael Grimm, and I'm the Assistant Administrator for Risk Management for the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the flood insurance rate maps and the steps FEMA is taking to help communities better understand the hazards posed by catastrophic flooding. As millions of American families have unfortunately experienced firsthand, flooding is the most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. Over the past 10 years, floods alone have caused over $155 billion in property damage. 98% of counties have experienced a flooding event. The most prevalent cartographic tool used to help communities understand their flooding risks are the flood insurance rate maps, or flood maps, and they provide the backbone of effective floodplain management. Flood maps are used for a variety of purposes. While most often associated with determining flood insurance premiums in the National Flood Insurance Program, flood maps also play a fundamental role in establishing land use, zoning, and building standards. Flood maps help communities ensure that development and infrastructure are constructed to protect lives and property. The local adoption of minimum NFIP standards has resulted in $100 billion in losses avoided over the past 40 years. Since the inception of the NFIP in 1969, our nation has invested approximately $10.6 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars for flood mapping. Although the type of data needed to create dependable flood maps has remained relatively consistent over the past 50 years, the tools and technology used to gather and share this information has changed substantially. For instance, paper-based flood maps have become digitally accessible to millions of Americans, and the traditional surveying methodologies have been replaced with more accurate and cost-saving techniques. One example is LiDAR technology, which has allowed FEMA and its partners, such as NOAA, to map flood hazard zones with increased efficiency and accuracy by measuring landscapes with laser-based survey and methodologies from aircraft. The modernization of techniques has made digital flood maps more adaptable and easier to update. As conditions change, flood maps require maintenance. With current resources, FEMA is able to validate 20% of our inventory annually to ensure that maps meet current standards. Working with states and communities, we must prioritize which maps should be updated in accordance with the highest risk or need, and then work with our partners to begin the cyclical process anew. While maintaining current flood maps is critical, we're still far from completing the initial job of mapping the entire nation. FEMA and state and local partners have historically prioritized limited mapping resources for areas with the greatest population levels and flood insurance policies on the assumption that these places represent the highest risk. While this approach has produced accurate and detailed maps in counties and communities with higher population levels, the unfortunate consequence is that many areas with potential for future development remain unmapped. Despite the progress we've made in modernizing the flood mapping process, there's still ample opportunity for continuous improvement. One of the most notable opportunities concerns the timeline for production of new flood maps. Although due process and careful deliberation is vital to ensure both the map's accuracy and buy-in of local partners, the extended procedures necessary to comply with current law can result in a situation in which new maps have technically expired by the time they're approved and publicly available. The development of a new flood map takes 7 years on average to complete. That juxtaposes present statutes, which require FEMA to reassess flood maps every 5 years in order to qualify as current. Another data concern often raised regarding current flood maps is lack of consideration about future conditions and sea level rise. These are important factors for a variety of reasons, as exemplified by the acceleration of daily tidal flooding in more than 25 Atlantic and Gulf Coast cities. While maps do not currently reflect the ways in which flood risks may change in the future, FEMA strongly encourages communities to incorporate anticipated future conditions into their projects and planning. For example, FEMA is actively coordinating with New York City through FEMA's Cooperating Technical Partners Program to pilot non-regulatory flood products that address future flooding scenarios. The intent is to ensure that today's designs address tomorrow's risk by integrating future sea level rise data into building code requirements and floodplain management. Improving the production of flood maps within the context of changing conditions and expanding nationwide flood insurance coverage is a strategic priority of FEMA. Through an initiative known as the Future of Flood Risk Data, FEMA aims to provide a comprehensive picture of the country's flood hazards through a graduated risk analysis. This more holistic understanding of present and future risks can serve as a basis for a range of both regulatory and non-regulatory products. Presently, flood insurance rate maps are binary representation of a single flood hazard, the 1% chance annual flood. As a result, firms can give a false impression to communities outside of the special flood hazard area that they have little or no flood risk. Graduated risk analysis could more effectively inform decision-making and drive action. FEMA looks forward to closely coordinating with our congressional and federal partners to improve this process, and thank you for the opportunity to testify and discuss this important aspect of our mission.
Thank you so much. And I have to apologize. I will be leaving shortly. The vote schedule upended my day a little bit. Fortunately, this is, as I mentioned, a very critical issue for my district. So I have two of my district directors here. I have Kelly Doucette and Jill Hirsch, and I look forward to hearing about your testimony and reviewing it afterwards. Thank you again. Next, we have Mr. Osler.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Sherrill, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Marshall, Ranking Member Norman, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me to testify. Part of NOAA's core mission is to protect lives and property and enhance the national economy. We do this by providing environmental information and predictions to the public. From real-time observations to daily weather and water forecasts and warnings to climate monitoring and sea level rise analysis, NOAA's products and services provide vital information to the public. These insights are underpinned by cutting-edge research, collaborative external partnerships, and thousands of dedicated scientists across the nation. To carry out our important mission in a changing world, NOAA has recently launched strategies to optimize our use of unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing to ensure that our work remains at the forefront of innovation. Our nation has a special challenge along our coasts. Our coasts are economic drivers. Coastal counties produce more than $8 trillion of goods and services annually and employ 56 million Americans. If our coastal counties were combined to be an individual nation, it would rank third in the world in GDP. This economic engine along our coasts is increasingly at risk. Water levels are rising. We observe more frequent flooding during high tides, even in the absence of storms. Great Lakes water levels are at record heights. And increased development along our coasts mean the impact of coastal hazards are more costly than ever. NOAA is at the forefront in the national response to these challenges. We deliver an array of water level and mapping services, which include NOAA's comprehensive inland flood watches and warnings, together with real-time hurricane surge forecasts and warnings, which provide a comprehensive picture of flooding and real-time impacts, which enable life-saving evacuation decisions. NOAA also supports coastal decision makers through platforms like Digital Coast, which include our sea level rise viewer, empowering communities to incorporate future risk within their long-range planning and capital improvement investments. And all of these products and services themselves are built on underlying data which NOAA produces to determine where the land and water are in relation to one another and how they are changing over time. NOAA builds and maintains the National Spatial Reference System, which defines latitude and longitude and elevation for the nation. We're currently hard at work modernizing this system to improve measurement accuracy. NOAA also maintains our nation's long-term network of tide stations. These stations provide tidal datums, historic water levels, and track rising sea levels. In order to deliver our mission, NOAA works with and supports many agencies, including FEMA. For example, NOAA actively participates in the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force, FEMA's Community Rating System Task Force, and provides experts to participate in FEMA's Technical Mapping Advisory Council. NOAA is working together with the U.S. Geological Survey, the Army Corps of Engineers, and FEMA to provide integrated real-time and forecast flood inundation maps along our nation's streams and rivers. And during natural disasters, NOAA has pre-scripted mission assignments in place which enable FEMA to request NOAA's support with emergency weather forecasting, aerial and underwater surveys that are used to identify hazards and accelerate response and recovery. There's a lot of talk these days about resilience, the ability to anticipate, adapt, withstand, and evolve from any disruption. The science involved in predicting and mapping environmental information is complex. We must continue to support the research and observations which enable these tasks. However, we must also respect the fact that even the best science and mapping will not increase safety and reduce economic loss without a clear understanding of how the public understands risk. Local decision makers must be supported in discovering for themselves how the relevant science relates to their local priorities and values, to their culture, to their history, and to the future they wish to forge for themselves. NOAA is proud to join together with FEMA and myriad partners in and outside of government to enhance our scientific understanding and participate in this shared engagement with the public about the risks that we face today and in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to be in dialogue together today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Branfort for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl, Chairman Foster and Norman, and especially to Dr. Marshall for this opportunity. I am a licensed surveyor, practicing photogrammetrist and GIS professional, and I'm honored to present my views on how geospatial data technology and services can improve FEMA flood mapping and better serve the American people. Our changing and evolving climate, sea level rise, subsidence, and other natural phenomena affects flooding that impacts American property owners, taxpayers, and FEMA as the custodian of the National Flood Insurance Program. As a Kansan, I can tell you these phenomena also affect American agriculture, crop insurance, and our food supply. America is blessed with a vibrant, capable, and qualified private sector geospatial community that provides an extraordinary array of data technology and services that contribute to our quality of life. I'd like to share with you today some thoughts on how these technologies can be used to predict future flood mapping rather than mapping past flood results. This would significantly save lives, protect property, improve building practices, and save tax dollars. I've got a few slides here to show some of the technologies and examples of state-of-the-art geospatial technologies that are available to assist FEMA. This first slide is several examples of, we've talked about the LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging. There's elevation data collected with the laser system. Next slide, please. Whoops, I can turn it here. The USGS 3-depth elevation program, or 3-depth, is satisfying the growing demand for consistent, high-quality topographic data and other three-dimensional representations of natural and constructed features, primarily using LiDAR. Among the leading applications that benefit from 3-depth is flood risk management. While FEMA has been the leading contributor to 3-depth apart from USGS itself, the program is not coming close to the $146 million per year that's needed to complete the mapping in the project and implement an 8-year update cycle. As my second slide shows here, about 67% of the nation has been mapped under 3-depth, but many areas still need elevation data. Before the 3-depth implementation, the average elevation data for the nation was 30 years old. In the areas in white, this data is still being used. From coastal mapping, if you'd read Chief Justice Roberts' dissenting views in Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, he noted that plaintiffs did not submit mapping to document the shoreline that it was losing. In fact, as National Academy pointed out, there are at least 22 different federal, state, and local definitions of shorelines. As noted, a single nationally accepted and consistent U.S. shoreline does not exist, and the use of inconsistent shoreline definitions between maps, charts, GIS outputs, and other products leads to user confusion and ill-informed decision-making. This map shows subsidence across the country. There's natural and anthropogenic subsidence in many areas of coastal and inland America. In many studies, this is ignored or discounted. As the map shows, there are portions of our nation that are extremely vulnerable to subsidence and other regions where there's no data at all. Coastal areas such as Houston have experienced extreme subsidence and are vulnerable to flooding. Rural inland areas such as the San Joaquin Valley in California experience subsidence due to groundwater extraction. This next slide shows the San Joaquin Valley where the extreme subsidence occurs. There's also, this slide here shows the Atlantic coast, Jersey Shore, subsidence occurring. NASA is beginning a program with very small-scale national land-level change map to monitor the subsidence change. For inland bathymetry, the Army Corps of Engineers has reservoirs that are 50 years old. Sediment buildup has greatly reduced the capacity of these reservoirs. As this slide shows, there's other areas, the same can be said for other lakes and inland waterways. We need bathymetric mapping and surveying of sediment monitoring to measure the capacity and be able to more accurately forecast flooding. For structures inventories, it's essential that all FEMA maps show structures. FEMA should investigate means for presenting flood risk to individual homeowners based on their elevations to their lowest adjacent grades or lowest floor elevations. LiDAR technology in particular is ideal for determining these elevations. In conclusion, I want to commend FEMA for doing the best job possible. It is a difficult job. I hope the construction recommendations I put forward today will be accepted and the program can provide an even greater service to our nation. Thank you for the invitation to present, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Berginnis for 5 minutes for your testimony.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Marshall, Ranking Member Norman, members of the subcommittees for holding this important hearing and inviting the Association of State Floodplain Managers to testify. I am Chad Berginnis, Executive Director of ASFPM, whose 20,000 members include many of the boots-on-the-ground state and local officials that use flood maps thousands of times each day to help guide development within their communities. If we measured success in how we manage flood risk by total losses in the nation, we're not doing so well. In the past decade, our conservative estimate is the nation's experienced an average of $17 billion in flood losses annually. And this is up from $10 billion annually in the 2000s. Why is this happening? There's a number of reasons, but the fact remains that far too many headlines repeat a familiar theme. People didn't know that they were at risk. For many years, our members at the state and local level have been concerned they simply don't have enough data to inform property owners about flood risks, to guide development, to plan for emergencies, or prioritize flood mitigation actions. In areas we have basic information like the 100 and 500-year flood data, we don't have information on other flood hazards or future conditions. These data are not available when development's occurring, and then we actually are building tomorrow's flood problems today. Think about this example. A subdivision is proposed in a community in an area that was previously agricultural. Because the small stream running through the property was never identified as a floodplain, homes are built, and then because there's now risk, it becomes a priority for FEMA mapping. A floodplain's identified after the fact, and now everybody's upset. Community officials and property owners then fight like heck to disprove the map, almost always to make sure that the mandatory purchase of flood insurance doesn't kick in. Another variation of this problem in a coastal area would be where revised flood maps come out, and let's say the flood elevations are actually lower than existing maps due to new modeling techniques. Because the maps don't include future flood conditions, however, local officials are stuck applying land use and building standards too low, given that the home will likely be there for 100 years or more. Future flood maps will eventually come out, and even if they just reflect the effect of sea level rise, property owners will face the same dilemma. Why didn't they know about when they built the home, and why didn't the community protect its tax base by building more resiliently? The fact is, we have a lot of work to do to fully implement the National Flood Mapping Program as envisioned by Congress when it was authorized in 2012. The program requires the identification and mapping of the 100 and 500 year in flood areas, areas of present and future population, future flood conditions, residual risk zones, and requires the inclusion of other relevant data from federal agencies. In short, the expectation set by Congress reflects how we, the people, already view FEMA flood mapping products as the authoritative source of flood hazard information. FEMA should continue to lead this effort. At the time Congress passed the National Flood Mapping Program, I recall testifying to Congress about the status of flood mapping in the country. Then we were talking a lot more about quality issues in FEMA's existing map inventory. Fortunately, FEMA's made good progress on that. The overall quality of the existing inventory has improved significantly, and the quality of the maps coming out today by using advanced techniques and technologies is quite good. However, we do what we measure. And while FEMA has made progress on the quality of mapping inventory, there's been little or no progress on expanding that inventory to map the nation as the law requires. The fact is, only 1/3 of our stream, rivers, and coastlines in the country are mapped. No appreciable mapping has occurred of future conditions, and while there's been some mapping of residual risk areas in the country, the data is not being reflected on FEMA's flood maps, and it's generally not publicly available. We can sympathize with FEMA's dilemma because to fully implement the vision of the National Flood Mapping Program, because Congress must appropriate those resources to get the job done. Earlier this month, ASFPM released our updated cost analysis for fully implementing the National Flood Mapping Program. A copy of that has been included with our testimony. While the costs are large, the cost of inaction and flood losses are much larger. The cost to get the job done is less than the cost of 6 months of flood disasters occurring in the United States. By investing in flood mapping now, we can avoid the increasingly large bill for unwise development decision and disaster losses later. In closing, I want to mention that our written testimony identifies some key points or key inputs into flood models and flood mapping. Please understand that having accurate flood maps to make the country more resilient requires not only a resourced and functioning national flood mapping program, but we must also have accurate information establishing rainfall frequencies, probable maximum precipitation estimates, maintain a robust network of stream gauges, and have tools to help our coastal and inland floodplain managers to be more effective, such as the Digital Coast website. Our testimony identifies several recommendations for you to take action. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony. I know we all appreciate your expertise. Before we proceed to questions from the members, I'd like to bring the subcommittee's attention to 5 documents we have received in preparation for this hearing. The documents all speak to the importance of improving science inputs into federal flood mapping and resilience efforts. The first is a statement from Dave Rosenblatt, the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Commissioner for Climate and Flood Resilience at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. The second is a letter from Dr. Rachel Cletus and the Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Clean Energy Program. Third, we have a statement from the Association of State Dam Safety Officials. And fourth is a report from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs titled Improving Coastal Resilience Toward a New National Flood Hazards Reduction Program. And finally, we have a letter from CoreLogic, Inc., a corporation that provides risk analysis and other intelligence information to clients. Without objection, I'll place these documents in the record. And at this point, we will begin our first round of questions. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Well, thank you again to all the witnesses for being here today. According to the 4th National Climate Assessment, projected increases in inland flooding over the coming century is estimated to result in an average annual damages of 1.2 to 1.4 billion each year by 2050. And as a result of sea level rise, coastal storms and high tides have already amplified coastal flooding and erosion. The Pacific Northwest and my home state of Oregon, which I noticed on your map, Mr. Branfort, didn't have a lot of green in your LIDAR mapping. We have a challenging history of flooding. Some as a result of early snowpack melt, increased precipitation, and warm temperatures in the spring. The mighty Columbia River, in fact, completely engulfed the community of Vanport in 1948. It crested 15 feet higher than the floodplain, jeopardized the livelihoods of thousands of residents. Then in 1996, I remember this one, the Willamette River flooding saturated the region, resulting in evacuations, mudslides, and significant property damage. In rural Columbia County, in 1996 and 2007, there was serious flooding from the Nehalem River. In Vernonia, it destroyed homes and schools in 2007, and then they had another major flood in 2015. And just earlier this month, Oregon declared a state of emergency in several counties as a result of flooding that had already occurred this year. We can only expect that these events will become more extreme and more frequent with the climate crisis. So first, according to the National Academy's report from last year titled Framing the Challenge of Urban Flooding in the United States, FEMA mapping methods for river and coastal flood hazards do not currently consider distinctive urban flood hazards. So, Mr. Berginnis, how could FEMA better address the growing urban flood risk?
Urban flood risk is a topic that's evolving very significantly. Actually, when I go out and talk to our chapters, one of the things that has struck me over the last couple years is almost everybody says, you know, it's one thing when we design our infrastructure for 1 to 2 inches of rain an hour, but we're seeing rainfall events that give you 3 to 4 inches in a half hour. How do we deal with that? And the National Academy study is one of 3 studies actually that came out in the last 12 months or so. There's also one by the University of Maryland, and the ASFPM Foundation just released a report a couple weeks ago on that. And I mention those because they're exploring different dimensions on it. Right now in the practitioner community, there actually isn't a lot of agreement on how we address urban flooding. There's a couple takeaways that we have, I think, on the practitioner side. One, the federal government can probably provide tools and resources, but there is a clear preference of not having something that emerges from the federal government that's regulatory. Because a lot of the stormwater management and the land use management associated with urban flooding is really done at that local and state level.
Sure, it varies a lot, I'm sure, from
exactly.
area to area.
So that would be, I would say that would be about the area of consensus right now is kind of tools and resources, but not regulatory.
Thank you. And Mr. Osler, how could federal science agencies, including NOAA, help FEMA better incorporate climate trends into urban flood risk assessments?
I think one of the key areas where we can collaborate, I think, more closely is that we see connections in the day-to-day at the practitioner level, but organizationally we have a greater need to be directed, I think, to have direct linkages. A lot of our programs between FEMA and NOAA are complementary, and they have grown up in recognition of each other, and yet that's people just paying attention to good government as opposed to a strict mandate. of how that linkage should happen and might happen.
Thank you. I'm going to get another question in. The climate crisis is changing the frequency and intensity of flooding. Floodplains are no longer as static as perhaps they were when the National Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968. So Mr. Berginnis is focusing on whether a property is or is not in the 100 or 500-year floodplain and accurate use of the best available science, or is the 1% annual chance flood the most appropriate indicator of high flood risk areas today?
Well, again, there's a lot of debate, and interestingly, there is a trend that we're starting to see some communities, especially those that are feeling the effects of climate change, moving to a higher standard, such as the 500-year flood elevation. Most recently, Houston and Harris County have done that. The city of Austin is doing that temporarily until they get new flood maps that reflect the current conditions.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to set a good example and yield back the balance of my time. I have an additional question I'll submit for the record. Next, I recognize Mr. Gonzalez for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for your consideration on the timeliness. So thanks for this hearing. I'm also on the Financial Services Committee, so we've sort of wrestled with this issue in that committee. Good to see it here. It's obvious to me that this needs to be done in collaboration. I think it's clear to me that we have to better adapt to a changing climate and take proactive steps that ensure Americans are protected from harm. One way to do that is to make sure that we're not building new homes or businesses in areas that have the potential to be wiped out. I'd like to start with Mr. Grimm. In your testimony, you highlighted the significant increase in annual flood losses since the 80s. In your estimation, what percentage of today's NFIP costs are associated with repetitive loss properties?
I know repetitive loss properties create a significant drain on the National Flood Insurance Program. You know, those are the properties that flood repeatedly. Many of them are outside of the floodplain, which causes the issue around the mapping program in terms of getting to mapping beyond the binary line. I'll have to get back to you on the exact percentage that is the drain on the number of claims on the program. It is significant. What I'd like to draw the attention to, though, is on the mapping program, moving away from the binary in and out nature of our flood maps.
Yep.
As one of the members pointed out, in 1968, when the maps were originally designed to be an insurance tool, many communities and states and local governments have moved well beyond that. We have to move away from that to a graduated risk analysis so that we can address those areas that flood outside of the current flood mapped area.
Can an individual today build a property in a flood-prone region and expect to be eligible for insurance coverage from NFIP?
In a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program, flood insurance is available for anybody inside a special flood hazard area or outside of a special flood hazard area.
I mean, it seems to me that this sort of behavior should be discouraged. I mean, if the way I look at this from a climate standpoint or an energy standpoint is we're very early stages with respect to what will probably be a multi-decade energy transition. Unless somebody can tell me that they can make steel, cement, plastic, or ammonia without fossil fuels, I have no idea how to do that at scale without them. And so I think we're very, very early stages. And so adaptation has to be central to the discussion and mitigation. And that's, I don't know that we spend enough time on that, frankly, with respect to the flood program, but talking about energy issues, period, is just the realities of where we are currently at in the energy transition and what it's going to take and how long it's going to take to get there. I think multi-decades at minimum. I'll stick with you, Mr. Grimm, for my last question. As you noticed in your testimony in 2015, TMAC recommended FEMA incorporate future flood hazard conditions. To this date, however, FEMA continues to only look at current risk. What specific steps is FEMA taking to incorporate this change, and what have been the biggest barriers to seeing it through?
Sure. Yeah, FEMA continues to consider all the recommendations of the Mapping Advisory Council around future conditions. They recommend for non-regulatory products looking at future conditions. To date, we've done a number of pilot efforts. I mentioned one in my oral testimony that we're currently working with New York City on sea level rise. We've also done a few others around the nation on the West Coast, as well as some inland areas and some erosion, future erosion potential. As I mentioned, I think as Chad mentioned, there's 3.5 million miles of streams in the United States. We've only mapped 1.1 million miles. Our resources and the decisions that we've had to make around with state and local governments is to focus those resources in those higher risk areas that we have made the assumption on insurance policies and population. Therefore, there are certain things that we have not been able to directly attack in the sense of future conditions on every flood map. What we do is we look to our partners such as NOAA and the Sea Level Rise Viewer and other technologies. Chad also mentioned and Mark mentioned Atlas 14 and keeping that up to date so that we can incorporate the appropriate data and technologies, and particularly around the Sea Level Viewer.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Lamb from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. We found out last year that the Army Corps of Engineers, their flood risk management efforts just in the upper Ohio River in my district, this was in 2018, prevented an estimate $1.11 billion in flood damages. And historically, kind of in the modern era, they estimate that to be $36 billion just for the Ohio. Anyone who's been to Pittsburgh knows we have 3 rivers. They converge at the city of Pittsburgh. And if you look at it all told, it's potentially more than $100 billion. A lot of it from the reservoirs that they built, 100 years ago in the 20s. Does FEMA, I'll start with you, Mr. Grimm, if that's okay. Does FEMA look at these steps that are being taken by the Army Corps historically and on an annual basis to prevent flooding damage as part of your assessment of and creation of the flood maps? Do you work with the Corps and take into account their research and work and their actual efforts on the ground?
Yeah, thank you, sir. We absolutely do. The Corps is, in fact, one very, very close partner. I currently have somebody from the Corps actually sitting outside my office who's on detail for 6 months, and we're coordinating on residual risk in the National Levee Database and other projects. When a project is constructed, FEMA absolutely works with the Corps of Engineers and state and local partners, and when appropriate, we incorporate those structures into our flood mapping program and the resulting flood maps.
Okay. So if they could do, let's say that next year in Western Pennsylvania, the Corps could only do 80% of the work that they did this year, because of less personnel and less budget. They couldn't work on the reservoirs as much or locks and dams or whatever, all the stuff that they do. Would that make it maybe harder to plan for future floods, or you would have to think that there might be more financial, that $1 billion money saved figure might get a little higher if the Corps is doing less work? Would you agree on that?
Yeah, so in order to have a Corps of Engineers structure reflected on the flood insurance rate map, it has to meet certain engineering standards that it reduces risk. As those structures progress and get completed, they get incorporated into the maps. If there's something that's, for example, under construction but not providing protection yet, we would not recognize that on the flood map. So any slowdown in work would, as a result, may not be reflected.
Okay, that's helpful. I was referring to the president's budget again this year offers to cut 22% from the Army Corps' overall budget, which, regardless of where they say that would come from, I think we can all assume it would lead to a slowdown in a lot of projects and ongoing construction. So I'm happy to hear you say that's important to your work, and we'll do what we can to restore or even grow that funding. The last thing I just wanted to ask, Mr. Branfort, you mentioned working with the Corps as well, which is obviously, they're very important to our region for a lot of reasons. But, we have these huge and historic reservoirs in the upper parts of our river, especially up on the Allegheny. I was not familiar with the terms that you use, and if you could just repeat I keep wanting to say bathification, which is an old word from the Iraq War, but what was?
Bathymetric.
Bathymetric, okay. So is that something that the Corps is already doing at reservoirs like we have on our rivers, or you're saying it's something they should be doing in the future?
It is happening on some of the reservoirs and
Okay.
rivers, yes.
But it could be
Primarily,
happening to a greater degree.
historically, it's been on navigable rivers is where we've done that, and then to dredge it, to keep the river channels open, but it has been occurring over the last several years on a number of reservoirs to monitor the sediment buildup.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that the older a reservoir is, the more likely it should undergo that kind of analysis?
That would make the most sense.
With these 100-year-old ones? Okay. And is it essentially what you're saying, that the sediment builds up over time on the sides and bottom, so you're sort of squeezing
You have less
water?
capacity, yes. We've seen, the one example I had up on the map was Cochise Reservoir in New Mexico, where the upper reaches are filled in 70 feet of sediment vertically.
And does the Corps contract with firms like yours to do that work, or do they just do it themselves? They contract typically?
Both.
Okay, both. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Babin from Texas for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here, your expert witness and testimony. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion on flood mapping, which happens to be of great importance to my district in southeast Texas. I represent the 36th district from Houston over to Louisiana. Southeast corner of Texas has been hit many times over the last few years. The accuracy and consistency of flood mapping is critical in my district, carrying tremendous impacts on communities and homeowners. It is important to realize that these maps cannot be done on a one-size-fits-all approach, and that the data that they are based on is critical to having accurate maps. I represent a community down in Hardin County, for example, Hardin County, Texas, which just went through an arduous process of redoing their flood maps with FEMA. Long story short, the new flood maps were almost drawn with data from 1975 instead of using the more recent data from 2010. This mistake was fixed by the community, but had it not been caught by the local water control improvement district, that it could have had a very significant detrimental impact on the community. So, Mr. Grimm, I have other counties that are using flood maps that are based on data from 20 to 30 years ago. And while different counties have maps like Hardin County, using up-to-date data based on aerial surveys and extensive studies, what is the determination for who is getting updated maps? Please, sir.
Sure, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
So FEMA works with, this is a shared responsibility, number one. This is a responsibility that working with the local government, working with the state government and the federal government and all the partners to work through the process of the mapping. We start the mapping process with what's called a discovery meeting, where we get together at the local level and bring everybody to the table to talk about what needs to be studied, what areas are at risk, and what areas we need to extend the mapping to. It's a conversation that takes some time. We then go into the data collection phase of that process, and eventually we get through the data collection and producing the flood map. It then goes through a process of public review. When you say public review, are you talking about that individual county or city or metropolitan area? Yeah.
The reason I'm asking this is because Hardin County, for example, they're scared to death. These new flood maps, they want to have input from the county, and they want to have transparency. So go ahead, resume. Thank you.
Yeah, sir. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, FEMA wants community and county input and review to be partners in this process. It is, we believe, is a shared responsibility, and we cannot do it without that conversation to happen. And I will commit to you that I am glad to reach out to our regional office and ensure that is happening. I am a terrific Region 6 office. I am confident that they do that, and I'd be glad to loop back with our regional folks to extend that.
That would be wonderful. And so I'm going to go on to you, Mr. Osler. Let's talk about the Atlas 14 approach. What is the methodology of this approach? And are there any arbitrary standards to this approach?
Thank you, sir. So Atlas 14 for the room is a product produced by NOAA that helps understand the statistical frequency of rainfall in different parts of the nation. One thing that's important to know, there is no steady authorized stream of funding for Atlas 14. It is not a funded, supported product by NOAA, despite its critical contribution to this discussion across the nation. And so what you asked about methods, that changes. That there is a pool funding mechanism to fund Atlas 14 where local municipalities or states essentially pass the hat to create the funding to trigger NOAA's uptake of an update to Atlas 14, typically at the state level. And so the approach then is state of the science, state of the measurements at whenever that update has been made. But if you look across the nation, it's a patchwork coverage now in the degree to which those data are up to date or not.
Okay, thank you. I have a few seconds left. Mr. Branfort, one of the slides you showed earlier zoomed in on a specific area outside of Houston that I recognize as Burnett Bay, which is in my district. Firstly, I'd like to know if this site was chosen for a reason other than its proximity to Johnson Space Center. And secondly, other than knowing where we might lose land mass, where businesses or houses have been developed, what is the value of knowing where land subsidence is occurring? Obviously, comparing images taken years ago to present images shows a change, but does this data help predict where subsidence might take place elsewhere in the country?
You know, first of all, that image was selected because that is a significant area of subsidence. It's just the amount of subsidence that's occurring there. We have very little data nationwide. As we monitoring subsidence nationwide, it's just the areas we've known where it's occurred and watched it. I don't think that gives us a forecasting tool for where it would happen in other places. One of the major problems with subsidence is it's gradual over a larger area, which takes down the survey control that's used to typically monitor elevation data, and it takes down the whole area, so you get a broader, more accurate map over the area.
All right, thank you. I have other questions, but I'm out of time, so thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the my colleagues who have helped work on putting this hearing together, and we thank all of our witnesses for their time and expertise that's shared today. As we have heard over and over again, floods are the primary culprit of natural disasters in the U.S., causing over $190 billion in damages last decade. This damage total has been increasing due to climate change-driven extreme weather events, raising concern amongst homeowners and investors about the safety and security of their property. The tool they must rely on to assuage those concerns, however, seems broken. FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, are meant to identify statistically likely flood risk. However, they have done a poor job of doing that lately. External estimates show that about 3 times as many people live in serious flood risk as are shown on FEMA maps, and these findings were sadly affirmed a few years back during Hurricane Harvey. 80% of the high water rescues during Harvey, 80% were outside the 500-year floodplain. So to repeat, the federal tool designed to predict even the slightest possibility of flood risk failed to predict 80% of the flood risk when they needed it most. No one should accept this failure rate, and we must improve our flood maps for the sake of American homeowners, business owners, and investors. So, Mr. Berginnis, you highlight one major strategy to improve our FEMA maps: simply finish mapping elevations. And I agree with you that we must finish this critical task. However, do you believe that accurate elevation data are enough to predict flood damage from these extreme storms, such as Hurricane Harvey?
In finishing the job, one of the things that I think is a credit to Congress in 2012 is recognizing the fact that we use flood maps in a lot of different ways and have different types of flood hazard areas. So not just a statistical floodplain, but residual risk, future conditions. And so when we talk about finishing the maps, we're also talking about adding those things that currently are not on the flood map. So it's actually doing both. And we think at least that's a good start, because one of the other aspects, and we mentioned this in our written testimony, is that other federal agencies and states are producing unique products. But one of the problems right now is that while FEMA has developed a good online tool that can layer data, there is not good connectivity to those state or other federal resources. FEMA had recently been able to work to get COBRA maps that now interface with that. And so we think that FEMA is going in the right direction, but it's not there yet.
Okay, and I thank you for that. And it's important that we recognize the widespread need for these climate data products. Climate data do more than predict temperatures. They save billions of dollars and thousands of lives. This administration is actively putting citizens at risk by decimating critical budget items needed to collect data critical for flood prediction. It looks to cut the USGS and NOAA, agencies that collect the data needed to predict future rainfall, stream flow, and floods, by 40% and 24% respectively. It zeroes out NASA's Earth science missions that monitor global climate. So I appreciate all of the work that is being done to improve our flood maps despite these backward views. However, we should demand that American scientists are given every tool available to do this job right for the American people. I'm just curious, too, with our agencies represented, is there discussion about climate change and the impact on flood mappings?
Absolutely. Climate is changing. FEMA is addressing climate in our program areas. We have incorporated sea level rise curves into our mitigation grant program, in our benefit cost analysis for use in grant awards, into our planning guidance for addressing to states and local governments for addressing mitigation planning at the national level. Most recently, we released the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, which is to bring the whole community together to align our investments, including around future conditions.
And NOAA would do the same thing? Or do you discuss climate change?
Not only discuss it, sir, but one of NOAA's core missions is to research and monitor our changing climate.
My obvious question is, how does that not percolate to the top of the executive branch? If we have climate impacting a lot of this mapping and data assimilation, why do we not accept the concept of climate change? Okay, I yield back.
Last round, I think for me, I just have one broad question that I'd like to throw out to each of you. As the science for identifying flood hazards evolves, FEMA's flood mapping program updates its engineering and mapping standards, including the models that are used. The standards are published, vetted, peer-reviewed, and updated regularly to ensure that they are aligned with current best practices. Every 5 years, FEMA reassesses the studies behind each flood map to see if the data and models that were used to create it meet current standards. Despite this, current best practices do not always grant accurate results in a nation with a rapidly changing climate and rising sea levels, with change in some areas occurring faster than 5-year intervals. So I think that's uncontroversial and more or less what we heard today. For each of you that would care to comment, I think the closing question we have is, what sources of data require improved data collection and or additional funding? So national rainfall frequency data, stream gauge data, tidal gauge data. In other words, if you were sort of designing your wish list data set or dream data set, what would it include, and any suggestions for how we could get it to you? Maybe starting with Mr. Grimm.
Sure. I think you read off the list, honestly. When we're pulling data together to make a flood map, you're putting together 4 buckets, 4 elements to a flood map. The topographic data, so that LIDAR, that 3-depth program, right? It's a critical element to what we do. We cannot produce accurate flood maps without accurate elevation data. Then you move into the hydrology and hydraulic areas in terms of how much water falls. That's my buddy here, and NOAA Atlas 14. And the hydraulics and advancements in technology on automated mapping techniques, for example, that the private sector often develops. Then you move into the base mapping and, the streets, the infrastructure, and collecting all of that data. Looking down the row here, there's a lot of folks who are collecting this data and a lot of agencies that collect this type of data that without it, FEMA won't be able to advance and move technology forward and have accurate data to produce an accurate flood map. And one thing I want to say, we want to move away from risk identification of that binary line. We want to move into graduated risk analysis and true flood management of multi-frequency hazards, including future conditions.
Thank you. Mr. Osler?
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Grimm nailed it in terms of the typical ingredients of earth science data that are needed to map floods. And so I would double down on that statement about foundational information. Where's the ground? Where's the water? How are those changing, both water from the ocean and from precipitation? I would note on the sea level rise front, we maintain just over 200 authoritative water level gauges, which have been installed in some cases for over 100 years. And these have been the harbingers of sea level rise and help us actually track and understand rates of change on the ground. The purpose of those gauges when they were initiated was not to track changing climate, but to help marine commerce, and that mission remains strong today. However, there are significant gaps now that sea level rise is affecting every part of our coastline and changing water levels on the Great Lakes. So we have gaps in our ability to accurately and in real time predict sea level change impacts in the areas in between those gauges. So we're talking seriously about revolutionizing the ability to model and fill in those gaps so that we can help provide even more detailed information.
Thank you. Mr. Branfort?
Definitely, both of them are referred to the 3-depth elevation-based model. There's a significant portion of this country, about a third of the country. Mr. Grimm referred to digital copies of paper maps, where the old paper maps have been converted to a digital format, but they're still, they were low accuracy to begin with and have been converted, and then we've had massive changes since then. So the base 3-depth elevation data for the nation is a starting point for all of it.
That's the key. And last, Mr. Berginnis?
And maybe being last, I could say all the above. But the one thing I do want to point out, and it was from Mr. Osler's testimony, while 3-depth, while stream gauging, the flood mapping program all have ongoing programs, authorities, requirements, and funding. Mr. Osler pointed out something I think that's key, and that is our precipitation frequency information, that Atlas 14. Currently, there's no mandate, and there's no sustained funding at all. That is a huge problem, because that's a key input into flood maps.
Thank you all. Before we bring this to a close, I want to thank the witnesses for testifying. The record will remain open for 2 weeks, and additional statements from the members or any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is adjourned.
I think this is my new favorite committee. They really believe